Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into one specific source.
That's right, a market forecast report.
Yeah, focusing entirely on the global Ladle Furnace Market.
Right.
Our mission really is to unpack the raw data from this report. It covers 2021, projecting out to 2033.
Exactly. We want to see what the numbers themselves tell us about, well, what might seem like a pretty niche industrial sector.
Right. What can market numbers really reveal? We're going to explore the size, the growth, the regional breakdown, all based purely on this data from cognitive market research.
And ladle furnaces, just for context, they're crucial in steelmaking, aren't they? Like giant refining kettles.
Precisely. They refine molten metal. So, the health of this market is definitely tied to demand for processed metals, especially steel.
Okay, so this report gives us a window into that demand. Let's start with the big picture, the global numbers.
Sounds good.
The report states the global ladle furnace market generated just over $1.2 billion in sales revenue in 2021. That's 1,228.1 full million to be exact.
Okay, wow. Over $1 billion. That gives us a sense of scale right away. And where's it headed?
Well, the forecast shows that climbing quite significantly. It's projected to hit about $1.5 billion, $1,533 million by 2025.
Okay.
And then expanding further to nearly $2.4 billion, $2,388.59 million by 2033.
Almost doubling in value over that, 12-year period from the baseline?
Pretty much, yeah.
And how does the report quantify that growth rate?
It uses the compound annual growth rate, CAGR. Basically, it's the average annual growth needed to get from the 2025 number to the 2033 number.
Right, kind of smooths out the year-to-year ups and downs.
Exactly. And for the global market from 2025 to 2033, the report puts that CAGR at 5.7%.
5.7%. Okay. So a market already over $1 billion, expected to grow steadily, nearly doubling in roughly the next decade. That's our global starting point then.
That's the big picture.
So now let's break it down. Where is this growth actually happening? Let's start with, say, North America.
Okay, North America. The report shows it's a significant market, valued at about $340 million, $340.19 million back in 2021. It's forecast to grow to roughly $409 million by 2025.
Okay.
And projected to reach over $616 million, $616.257 million by 2033.
And its growth rate, the CAGR, how does that compare to the global 5.7%?
It's a bit lower, actually. The North America CAGR from 2025 to 2033 is pegged at 5.248%.
So still solid growth, but lagging slightly behind the global average.
Right. Consistent, but maybe not quite as dynamic as the overall picture.
And if we drill down within North America, who are the main players according to this data?
Well, no surprise, the United States is clearly the dominant market there.
Yeah.
Started at over $265 million by 2025.
Okay.
And projected to hit over $375 million by 2033.
And its CAGR, is it pulling down the regional average?
It's very close to the regional average, actually, 5.163%. So it's large, but its growth rate is pretty much in line with the region overall.
Got it. What about Canada and Mexico?
Canada's market was around $43 million in 2021. That's forecast to reach over $81.5 million by 2033. Its CAGR is 5.652%.
Ooh, okay, so that's higher than the U.S. rate, closer to the global average.
It is, yeah. And Mexico was slightly smaller, starting around $32 million in 2021, projected to grow to nearly $60 million by 2033. Its CGR is 5.385%.
So interesting. The U.S. is the giant in terms of value, but Canada and Mexico are actually forecast by this report to grow a bit faster in percentage terms.
That's what the numbers suggest, yes. While the U.S. market is huge, its neighbors might be contributing slightly more proportionally to the region's future growth rate.
Fascinating. Okay, let's cross the Atlantic. Europe. How does the European market compare in size and growth?
Europe is another major market, slightly smaller than North America in 2021, around $302 million.
Yep.
The report projects it to reach about $368 million in 2025 and climb to over $566 million by 2033.
And its CAGR, is it closer to North America's or the global rate?
It's actually quite close to the global average, 5.534%. But what's really striking in Europe, based on this data, is the variation within the continent, big differences between countries.
Ah, okay. Give us some examples. Who's growing fast, who's slower?
Well, Germany, a major industrial hub, is forecast to grow at a very healthy 5.992% CAGR.
Wow, nearly 6%.
Yeah, taking its market from just under $50 million in 2021 to almost $100 million by 2033. The UK also looks strong, 5.755% CAGR.
Okay, both above the European and global average.
Yeah.
Are there significant markets growing much slower?
Yes, definitely. Italy, for instance, is projected at only 4.068% CAGR.
Oh, that's quite a bit lower.
It is. And Sweden is also relatively low at 4.341%. France is sort of in the middle, 4.561%.
So a real mix then. Within
Wow.
a region growing roughly at the global average, you've got these pockets of much stronger growth like Germany and others like Italy that seem to be lagging quite a bit behind.
Exactly. The report also lists several others. Russia's at 5.233%. Spain's quite strong at 5.736%.
Close to the UK rate.
Yeah. Then Denmark at 5.217%, Switzerland a bit lower, 4.761%, Luxembourg around 5%. So, a diverse picture.
And there's usually a rest of Europe category in these reports. Did anything stand out there?
Yes, that was really interesting. That segment, covering all the other European countries not listed individually, it showed a projected CAGR of 6.245%.
Whoa, hang on. 6.245%. That's higher than Germany, higher than the UK, higher than almost everything listed individually.
It is significantly higher than the overall European average. It suggests that, according to this data, a lot of the future dynamism in Europe might come from this collection of perhaps smaller or unlisted markets.
That's a key takeaway from the numbers right there. Activity beyond the usual suspects.
Okay, let's pivot now to Asia Pacific, often seen as the big engine for global manufacturing.
And the numbers here absolutely back that up. Asia Pacific was already the largest regional market back in 2021, nearly $440 million.
Wow, bigger than North America and Europe even then. Yeah. And it's projected to surge past $551 million in 2025 and forecast to hit over $902 million by 2033.
Okay, nearly $1 billion on its own by 2033. What about its growth rate, the CAGR?
This is where it really stands out. The Asia-Pacific CAGR is 6.347% from 2025 to 2033.
6.347%. Okay, that is the highest regional rate we've seen so far.
By a noticeable margin, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely positioning it as the primary growth engine for ladle furnaces based on this forecast.
And which countries are driving that incredible growth? I imagine China plays a big role.
A huge role. China is the largest single-country market globally in this data. It started at over $163 million in 2021.
Right.
And is projected to reach over $361 million by 2033. And get this, its CAGR is 6.926%.
Almost 7%. Wow.
Yeah, and India is right up there too, showing incredibly strong growth. Its CAGR is forecast at 6.854%.
Okay, so China and India together are just massive drivers. India's market size.
India started around $77 million in 2021, projected to grow to over $169 million by 2033.
So those two alone are adding a huge amount of value and growing incredibly fast. How do other significant Asian economies compare, like Japan or South Korea?
Well, Japan is a large established market, over $55 million in 2021. It's growing solidly, but not quite at China-India pace. Its CAGR is 5.905%.
Still very healthy, above the global average.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
South Korea is also growing steadily, started around $29 million, projected to reach over $51 million. Its CAGR is 5.227%.
Okay, more in line with, say, North America's average.
Exactly. The report also lists others like Australia, 5.288% CAGR, Singapore a bit lower, 5.044%, Taiwan at 5.492%, and then there's a Southeast Asia segment,
Right.
which is projected to grow at 5.616%. So still contributing significantly to the overall size, but the truly explosive growth rates in APAC, according to this report, are really concentrated in China and India.
Got it. Okay, let's move on. South America, how does that region look?
South America is a smaller market compared to the big three, obviously. It started at around $46.7 million in 2021. But interestingly, it's projected to grow pretty robustly, expected to reach over $124 million by 2033.
Over 124 million in its growth rate. The CAGR.
This is another interesting point. The South America's CAGR is 5.957% from 2025 to 2033.
Wait, 5.957%? That's higher than North America and Europe.
It is.
And slightly above the global average, too.
That's right. It suggests, significant future potential in this region, at least according to this forecast.
Interesting. So who's driving that within South America? Brazil.
Brazil's definitely the largest market there. Valued at just over $15 million in 2021, it's projected to grow to over $41 million by 2033. And its CAGR is strong, 6.159%.
Over 6%. Okay, so Brazil is a key driver. Anyone else with high growth?
Colombia also shows a high growth rate, actually, 6.129%, similar to Brazil's rate, but from a smaller base, started around $3.5 million.
Still significant percentage growth. What about others like Argentina?
Argentina's CAGR is listed at 5.157%. Peru's at 5.319%. Chile is 5.619%.
Okay.
And again, there's a rest of South America segment here.
And let me guess, It's growing fast.
You got it. Growing at a brisk 6.097% CAGR.
So similar pattern to Europe, the rest of category is growing faster than several of the individually listed countries, suggesting pretty dispersed growth across the continent.
This seems to be a recurring theme in the data, yeah.
All right, let's turn our attention now to the Middle East. What story do these numbers tell us there?
The Middle East market was valued at roughly $59 million in 2021. It's forecast to reach just over $100 million by 2033, so $100.321 million.
Okay, crossing the 100 million mark. And the regional growth rate, the TAGR.
The Middle East KGR is 4.224%.
Oh, okay, that's noticeably lower than all the other regions we've discussed.
It is. It's the lowest regional CAGR presented in this report.
Quite a contrast to Asia Pacific or even South America. What are the country specifics driving that lower average? Saudi Arabia is usually a big economy there.
Right. Saudi Arabia is the largest market within the region, started at nearly $23 million in 2021, but its projected CAGR is relatively modest, only 3.7%.
3.7%. Yeah, that would pull the average down. How about Turkey or the UAE?
Turkey's AGR is 4.046%. The UAE is a bit higher at 4.506%. Egypt is similar, 4.438%, and Qatar is 4.374%.
So generally slower growth, kind of clustering around that low 4% mark across the major listed economies in the Middle East compared to other global regions.
That seems to be the picture, yes.
The
However, there's that exception again.
rest of that category.
Exactly. The rest of the Middle East segment, it's the smallest in value, starting at about $3.1 million in 2021.
Okay.
But it's projected to grow at a CMGR of 7.292%.
Wow, 7.3%.
Yeah.
That's the highest CMGR we have seen anywhere in this entire report, isn't it?
It is, by quite a margin. It's a tiny piece of the overall Middle East market in terms of value.
Right.
But proportionally, it's showing absolutely explosive growth according to this data. Really stands out.
That is fascinating. A tiny segment growing faster than China or India. Okay, finally, let's look at the African market data provided in the report.
Okay, Africa. Another region with a, smaller market size overall. Started at just over $40.5 million in 2021.
And its projection.
Projected to nearly double, reaching over $78.8 million by 2033.
Okay, nearly doubling. What about its KGR?
The Africa CAGR is 4.925% from 2021 to 2033.
4.925%, so below the global average, but notably higher than the Middle East region overall.
Correct. Kind of sits between the Middle East and, say, North America or Europe in terms of growth rate.
Does the report give specific country data for Africa?
It lists a few key ones. Nigeria, for example, is shown growing from about $9.7 million to over $19 million. Its KGR is 5.141%.
Okay, slightly above the regional average.
Yeah. And South Africa, which is a larger market in value terms, started over $16 million in 2021, shows a slightly lower CGR of 4.742%.
Below the regional average, then.
Right. And the rest of Africa segment here grows at 4.98%, so pretty much right on the regional average.
Okay. So, while maybe not the fastest growing region globally, the data suggests Africa shows fairly steady growth, with Nigeria perhaps slightly outpacing South Africa in percentage terms, according to this forecast.
That seems to be the summary based on these figures, yes.
Wow. We have navigated through a lot of numbers there. Values, CAGRs, continents, countries. Let's try and pull back for a second and synthesize what this deep dive into the data really tells us overall.
Okay. Well, we started with that global market figure. Over $1 billion in 2021, heading towards $2.4 billion by 2033. That scale itself is pretty noteworthy for what seems like a specific piece of industrial kit.
Definitely. And the growth rate, 5.7% globally, is solid.
Right. Then the regional picture became clear. The data absolutely points to Asia-Pacific as both the largest market currently and the fastest growing region.
Yeah, that's 6.3% plus CAGR, driven largely by that immense growth forecast for China and India, really stands out.
No question. Then you have North America and Europe, also major, established markets. Their growth rates are steady, closer to the global average.
But Europe had that interesting internal variation, didn't it? Germany and the UK strong, Italy and Sweden lagging a bit based on these numbers.
Exactly. And then those surprising, really high growth rates in the rest of Europe.
And the rest of the Middle East.
Yeah, those really highlight potential expansion happening perhaps outside the biggest, most commonly reported economies within those regions. At least that's what this data implies.
And South America also stood out, didn't it? With a regional KGR slightly above the global average.
Right, indicating strong emerging demand there, particularly the rates shown for Brazil and Colombia.
while the Middle East as a whole came in as the slowest growing region overall, despite that one tiny, super fast growing rest of segment.
Correct. And Africa showed consistent, if slightly below average, growth across its main listed markets.
It's really quite remarkable how just looking at these market size and growth numbers purely from this one report can start to paint a picture of, global industrial activity and maybe where investment is flowing or projected to flow over the next decade.
It absolutely provides a quantitative snapshot. It shows where the demand for these foundational components, like ladle furnaces, is expected to be strongest and perhaps weakest based solely on these projections.
So this deep dive into the numbers of the global ladle furnace market has definitely revealed some clear patterns, the sheer scale, but also these significantly different growth trajectories across the world.
It really underscores how broader economic and industrial dynamics seem to play out, even down to very specific niche sectors like this one.
So thinking about everything we've just discussed, all those stark differences in growth rates shown in this report, high-flying Asia-Pacific versus the slower Middle East, or those unexpectedly fast-growing rest of segments compared to some big individual countries. What underlying factors might explain these variations we're seeing in the demand for something as specific as ladle furnaces over the next 10 years or so? What are these numbers really telling us about the bigger picture of global industry?
That's the big question this data leaves you pondering, isn't it? Yeah. A very good point to think about. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a piece of industrial tech that's absolutely fundamental, really, to modern life. Yet it's, a real workhorse operating quietly behind the scenes. We're talking about the ladle furnace in steelmaking.
Right, and you should think of it not just as, a furnace, but as the critical refining step. It takes that raw, molten metal, tapped from the main furnace and transforms it. It purifies it, fine-tunes it into the precise, high-quality steel that today's world really demands.
Right.
It's where steel gets its specific personality, you could say, its strength, its resistance.
Exactly. And our source material for this deep dive, it really digs into the global ladle furnace market, pulling insights particularly from cognitive market research.
Okay.
So our mission really is to unpack why this seemingly specialized piece of equipment is seeing significant market growth, what major challenges stand in its way, and what exciting innovations are shaping its future.
Yeah, it's a market that the research suggests is on a pretty steady upward path.
Yeah.
But like, any big industrial technology, it's constantly battling costs, complexity, and, the need for innovation.
So let's jump right in then. What's the primary force pushing steelmakers to invest in and upgrade their ladle furnaces right now?
Well, the biggest driver, hands down, is the escalating global demand for premium and specialty steels. We're sort of past the era where steel was just steel.
Right. Generic stuff.
Exactly. Industries like automotive, modern construction, the energy sector, they require alloys with incredibly precise characteristics.
Like what specifically?
Oh, things like specific tensile strength, corrosion resistance for really harsh environments, the ability to withstand extreme temperatures, that kind of thing.
So you can't build a modern, lightweight, fuel-efficient car or, say, a high-pressure oil pipeline with just any old steel anymore?
Precisely. You need steel tailor-made for the job, and that often requires complex alloy compositions and extremely low levels of impurities. And the market for this specialty steel isn't just growing. Cognitive market research points out it's booming at a CAGR of over 5%.
Wow, okay.
And this is where the ladle furnace becomes, non-negotiable. It's the stage where you make those critical alloy additions under really controlled conditions, remove unwanted elements like sulfur and phosphorus down to trace levels, manage dissolved gases.
So it's the quality control hub, basically.
It really is. Without that intense refining in an LF, producing these high-performance, high-value steels reliably is simply impossible.
Okay, so the demand for better performance is directly fueling the demand for the tech that delivers it. Makes sense. What's another big factor driving this LF market growth?
There's a significant ongoing shift in how steel is initially melted, this global pivot towards electric arc furnace, or EAF, steel production.
EAFs, those are the ones that primarily use recycled scrap metal, right? Yeah. Which sounds like a pretty big deal for sustainability.
Absolutely. They consume largely scrap, which makes them more resource efficient, and generally they have a lower carbon footprint compared to traditional blast furnaces that rely on iron ore.
Okay.
And the rise of the EAF is intrinsically linked to the need for LFs. EAFs are excellent at melting scrap quickly, But the molten metal they produce, well, it often requires more extensive refining afterward.
Why is that?
Because
Because the scrap is variable.
Exactly. The varied nature of the scrap input means you might get different types of impurities or just more variability batch to batch that then needs to be dealt with specifically.
Ah, okay. So an EAF gets the metal hot fast, but it's maybe not as clean initially.
You could put it that way. It needs that downstream refinement. So pairing an EAF with a dedicated ladle furnace creates a highly efficient tandem process.
Right.
The EAF focuses solely on melting, getting the crude liquid steel ready, while the LF handles all the complex, sometimes time-consuming steps: chemistry adjustment, purification, temperature homogenization.
So as more mills adopt EAFs for flexibility and, the environmental side, they simultaneously create a greater need for sophisticated LFs to handle that refining and keep the whole production line flowing.
Precisely. It keeps everything moving smoothly.
It sounds like the LF isn't just a refinement step then. It's essential to optimize the entire melt shop flow, especially when using EAFs. And that leads us to the third driver you mentioned, right? Productivity.
Spot on. The LF is a game changer for plant productivity because it effectively decouples the refining stage from the primary melting furnace.
Decouples, meaning it separates the jobs.
Exactly. This is huge. It
Yeah.
means the expensive high-power melting furnace, whether it's an EAF or even a basic oxygen furnace, doesn't get tied up doing the slower, more intricate refining work.
Ah.
It can tap its heat, get that batch out, and immediately start preparing for the next batch of molten metal.
So you're basically giving the main melting furnace permission to just melt,
Right.
while the LF takes the baton for the complex chemistry stuff.
That's exactly it. And the practical outcome is a dramatic reduction in what's called tap-to-tap time. That's the cycle time. From finishing one batch of steel to starting the next in the melting furnace, the sources highlight this can be reduced by as much as 20% or even more.
20%. Wow, that's substantial in a high-volume industry like steel.
It really is. For a steel plant, a 20% gain in cycle time translates directly into significantly higher throughput, potentially greater yields from the same equipment footprint, and just overall optimized operations.
Yeah.
That kind of efficiency gain makes a very compelling investment case for any steel producer.
Okay, I can see that. So the market's being pushed forward by demanding customers needing better steel, a fundamental shift in melting technology, and this relentless industrial drive for greater efficiency. That all sounds incredibly positive. But a complex technology like this must face some serious hurdles.
No.
What are the biggest restraints holding the market back or making these investments difficult?
You hit it right on the head. Complexity and cost are major factors. The primary restraint is the sheer capital investment required for a ladle furnace setup.
Right. It's not just buying the furnace itself.
Not at all. You need a heavy-duty electrical transformer to supply the intense power. You need sophisticated fume capture. And treatment systems, environmental controls are key, and complex material handling for adding alloys and managing slag.
That sounds like building a small power plant in a sort of chemistry lab around a giant crucible.
It really does involve significant infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that's just the upfront cost. Then come the substantial ongoing operational expenses.
Like what?
Well, the massive electricity consumption needed to reheat or just maintain temperature, the cost of the large graphite electrodes that generate the heat, and the frequent replacement of the refractory linings that actually contain the molten steel.
Oof.
These expenditures can be particularly challenging, especially for smaller steel producers or maybe those operating in regions with high energy costs.
Yeah, I can completely see how that initial sticker shock plus the ongoing bill could make companies hesitate. What else makes running these challenging? Is it just the money?
Well, beyond the hardware and energy, there's a critical human element, the requirement for highly skilled manpower. The people side.
Exactly. Running an LF isn't something you can learn overnight. It demands operators and metallurgists with a deep understanding of steel chemistry, precise control over temperature profiles, the ability to manage and adjust slag composition in real time, and, accurate execution of alloy additions.
So it's less about brute force and more about metallurgy and really delicate control, almost like a science experiment on a massive scale.
Exactly. It requires specialized expertise, almost like, industrial alchemy. And finding, training, and retaining people with that specific blend of theoretical knowledge and practical experience, well, that can be a significant constraint.
Especially in certain regions, I suppose.
Particularly in certain geographical regions, or even just during periods of high industry growth when demand for those skills is intense.
Right. And thinking about that intense environment you mentioned, inside the furnace, the heat, the corrosive slag, What about the materials that are constantly exposed to that? That must be an issue too.
That leads directly to the third major restraint,
Yeah.
the intense wear on consumables. Consumables meaning.
We're talking primarily about the graphite electrodes used for heating and the refractory bricks lining the furnace. These materials are operating at incredibly high temperatures, often interacting with aggressive slag chemistry that's designed specifically to pull out impurities.
So it's a constant battle against melting and corrosion from the inside out,
Mhm.
basically.
It is. And that brutal environment means these critical consumables have a limited lifespan. They wear out relatively quickly.
Which means more cost and downtime.
Exactly. It requires frequent replacements and incurs high maintenance costs. The durability and performance of these consumables directly impact how often the furnace needs to be shut down for maintenance, affecting overall uptime, productivity, and ultimately profit margins. Improving their lifespan is a constant R&D focus.
Okay, so we've got growth driven by quality demands, technology shifts, and efficiency needs. But it's restrained by high costs, the need for specialized human expertise, and the sheer wear and tear on the materials. That paints a really clear picture of the current landscape. But you mentioned innovation earlier. How are companies pushing back against these restraints and, shaping the future of the ladle furnace?
Yeah, this is where we see some really fascinating trends emerging. A major one is the rapid adoption of advanced automation and integration with Industry 4.0 concepts.
Like bringing smart factory principles right into the heart of steel production.
Precisely. The sources highlight that top-tier ladle furnaces are now equipped with sophisticated Level 2 automation systems and an array of smart sensors.
And these aren't just basic on-off controls.
No,
Yeah.
no. These systems can analyze real-time data from the melt, predict things like temperature loss much more accurately, automatically calculate and execute precise alloy additions, and even autonomously manage power input based on the steel's current state and its target chemistry.
Wow. That sounds like it takes a tremendous amount of variability and potentially human error out of the process, especially with those critical chemistry adjustments you mentioned.
It really does. It leads to a much more consistent, repeatable, and ultimately optimized refining process. Cognitive market research emphasizes how this automation is a key factor in boosting overall efficiency and driving down operational costs.
Absolutely.
By minimizing errors, reducing energy waste through optimized power use, and just streamlining the entire operation. It's making the whole LF process much smarter.
Fewer errors, less waste. That makes a lot of sense. What's another significant trend you're seeing?
Well, there's a strong and growing focus on energy efficiency and environmental compliance. That's huge right now.
Driven by costs and regulations, I assume.
Exactly. As electricity prices continue to rise in many places and environmental regulations, particularly around emissions and dust, become stricter globally, steelmakers are heavily investing in making the LF process greener and, frankly, cheaper to run.
How does that actually manifest in the technology itself? What changes?
We're seeing innovations like the design of highly efficient furnace roofs, specifically engineered for better fume capture. We're seeing optimized power management systems to draw energy more effectively and minimize peak loads.
Okay.
And even using techniques like oxygen lancing within the LF to supplement or maybe reduce reliance on electrical heating for temperature control.
Interesting.
The overarching goal is to lower the kilowatt hours required per ton of steel refined without compromising the quality of the final product.
So tackling both the cost side and the environmental footprint simultaneously makes sense. What's the final big trend you're seeing?
It ties back nicely to that restraint we discussed, the wear on consumables. There's a fascinating and continuous trend in developing higher performance consumable materials.
So instead of just accepting the wear and tear, innovators are fighting it with better material science.
Exactly right. There's ongoing R&D in areas like ultra-high power graphite electrodes. These have improved conductivity and less tip wear, and advancements in refractory materials like magnesia carbon bricks that offer enhanced resistance to thermal shock and chemical attack from those aggressive slags we talked about.
And the benefit here is pretty straightforward, isn't it? Longer life and lower operating cost.
Precisely. These innovations lead to extended furnace campaign life, which means less frequent shutdowns for maintenance. And ultimately, that means lower operational costs by reducing the expense of replacement consumables and minimizing that costly downtime.
Right.
It's really about pushing the boundaries of material science to cope with that incredibly harsh operating environment and improve the economic case for running LFs.
Okay. So summing this all up, then, the ladle furnace market is definitely heating up, you could say, propelled by the fundamental need for higher quality steel the big shift towards EAFs, and that ever-present drive for productivity improvements in steelmaking.
Absolutely. And at the same time, the technology itself is being fundamentally reshaped by these exciting innovations from smart automation and Industry 4.0 integration to a really strong push for energy efficiency and breakthroughs in the very materials used inside the furnace.
Yeah, cognitive market research points to a strong outlook for this market overall, but it clearly requires significant upfront capital
Definitely.
and a real commitment to leveraging these advanced technologies and achieving operational excellence to truly succeed.
It really highlights how what might seem like just a simple holding vessel is actually this incredibly sophisticated hub where metallurgy, engineering, and cutting-edge technology all converge.
And that's really the core of it, isn't it? When you look at the ladle furnace, you're not just seeing a piece of industrial equipment. You're witnessing that critical stage where steel transforms from just a raw melt into a high-specification material.
Yeah.
It's the place where its final properties are defined, dictating its value and its potential uses in, well, everything from our cars to our buildings. It's truly a deep dive into how the metal that shapes our world gets its essential character.